Quite often, you will, where these discs are seen, there will be a report of tilting up for a very steep climb, although some of them have been seen to rise almost vertically without tilting. It is now fairly well certain that these things operate with a revolutionary type of propulsion involving an artificial gravity field. I mean, they simply could not maneuver in our atmosphere several thousand miles an hour if they were ordinary vehicles, because they would burn up from friction and they would cause sonic booms that would be heard all over the country.
Anyway, everything is relative, actually. Like I say, you're on Earth, you don't feel the motion. With all this great speed that we're actually being under existence, not to a UFO, to the people in the flying saucer, whoever controls it, everything is relative to them. In other words, as we are relative to the Earth, they are relative to the flying saucer. As that flying saucer makes a 90-degree turn, it doesn't affect them just as well as we're not affected by us traveling through space at the great rate that we are. I don't know if this can be easily seen, but if you stop and think about it, it's true. You can consider the flying saucer as its own little Earth, with its own gravitational field, and it's traveling through space. All of a sudden, it makes a sharp turn. Well, everybody inside that ship...
Let me interrupt a second. Could it be like, for example, you've seen these little balloons that they sell to children. It'll be a balloon inside of a balloon. Inside of that balloon, they'll have a little picture of Mickey Mouse, maybe. Is this like the Mickey Mouse inside that balloon would be like the spaceship inside this gravitational field that it's creating?
Right. You could look at it that way. So basically, that's it. As you are to the Earth, somebody is to this ship.
What creates this gravitational field?
Well, as far as this creation of the gravitational field, it could be one of many things. Now, one possible theory was, and this is proposed by a few scientists, I've read this before, that like that principle that I told you, that you could take a vacuum chamber, and it's possible this has been done in a laboratory. You have two huge magnets with a terrific coulombs of energy passing through them. You have a little metal object in there, and it will suspend itself in midair. Now, if this was applied in reverse onto the ship itself, it could be deflecting the Earth's magnetic attraction. Now, one thing that's more or less possible proof of why these ships work on magnetic attraction, and it would be specifically of the Earth and not another planet, is this, that I don't know if you noticed or not, but the recent reports on any flying saucers around this area, most of them will be in Akron. There's a reason for this, because near Akron, or not far away from Akron anyway, I don't know the exact mileage, but a geophysicist or somebody on that line could probably tell you that there is a magnetic fault running through the Earth at pretty close to Akron, or in that area anyway. And magnetic faults are lines of specific intensity, a little bit greater intensity than other places. In other words, like the, latitude or longitude running from the north to the south? Longitude. Well, you could consider those like the longitudinal lines, only they're not really. But they run from north to south. And as you pass to this point, or to this line, you are going to a point of greater magnetic attraction. And this has been picked up by satellites recently, and it's data. And you go to one magnetic, you can see by instrumentation, you have a greater magnetic attraction as you approach this line. As you go away from it fades out. You go to the next line, it comes in again, it increases.
Well, actually, this whole thing of creating its own gravitational field around it may seem completely far-fetched and everything, because this is like a mode of transportation carrying its own mode of transportation. But yet, there was the day when everything was done by oneself, transportation was done by something living, an animal of some kind, when it did look completely ridiculous to ever think of a machine that would actually move without a human being pulling it. An automobile, ridiculous.
They don't move in the speed, in the way that we move. Instead of, we travel so many miles per hour. Yeah. But instead of this, they bend distance. They do not bend time, they bend distance, space itself. Like if you'd take a string, this end and this end, and bend them directly together. If you would flip the switch, the end just comes together, and you're at that spot. As strange as it seems, as hard as it is to believe, these people told me that our government, our own government, here on this earth, could travel at any speed far greater than the speed of light right now. They have the means, they have the ways, if they could control the gravity itself that would keep from crushing or disintegrating the objects in which our government will move. They have the ways to move it, but they cannot control it. These people do have a way to control it.
We know that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, so in our universe we've always assumed that the fastest way from point A to B was to travel in a straight line at the speed of light. Well, the fact is that when you're dealing with space-time and you enjoy the capability of generating an intense gravitational field, the fastest way from point A to B is to distort or warp or bend the space-time between point A and B, bringing point A and B closer together. The more intense the gravitational field, the greater the distortion of space-time and the shorter the distance between points A and B. Most of us think of space-time as the void or as nothing. And remember, it wasn't that long ago that man considered the air in our atmosphere to be nothing. Yet with time, we've become aware of the elements and properties of the air in our atmosphere. Well, indeed, space-time is an entity, and one of its properties is that it can be distorted or bent by a gravitational field. We know that gravity bends or distorts space-time and light by virtue of the fact that we're able to see stars which we know should be blocked from our view by the sun. Referring to the graphic here, the solid line denotes the position of a star that's located behind the sun, and the dotted line shows its position as viewed from Earth. This is made possible because the sun's gravitational field distorts the space-time and light around the sun, allowing us to view stars which should be hidden from view. We know that gravity distorts time by virtue of the fact that if we take two identical atomic clocks and keep one at sea level and take the other one up to a high altitude, when we bring them both back together, they reflect different times. The difference in this passage of time is caused by the fact that a gravitational field weakens the further you get from the source. So the atomic clock which was taken to the high altitude was exposed to a less powerful gravitational field than the clock which we kept at sea level. The effect of a gravitational field on space-time is something that we've been able to observe, but not to experiment with. This is due to our inability to generate a gravitational field. And up until this point in time, great mass such as a star, planet, or moon was the only source of a discernible gravitational field that we're aware of. So just as the gravitational field around great mass such as a planet distorts space and time, any gravitational field, whether naturally occurring or generated, distorts space and time in a similar manner. Now, the great benefit of generating an intense gravitational field is not only can you turn it on, but you can turn it off. If we refer back to our original illustration of space-time distortion, we can see that when we generate an intense gravitational field, we can distort the space-time and in turn the distance between the point where we are and the point where we want to be. We can then position ourselves at the point where we want to be and then stop generating the gravitational field, allowing space-time to return to its natural form. In this manner, we can travel great distances with little linear movement. And this is how space-time distortion translates into reduced distance. Now back to our original question, how is it possible to cross the vast expanses of space required for interstellar travel without exceeding the speed of light? This is accomplished by generating an intense gravitational field, distorting space-time and allowing you to cross many light years of space in little or no time and without traveling in a linear mode near the speed of light.
How do these spacecrafts work?
It's a very, very fascinating science because...
Don't be too technical.
I'll do my best. As Carl Sagan often has said, it's not logical for us to even consider traveling to the nearest star system due to the concepts of linear travel. It doesn't matter how fast you go, even if you can approach the speed of light, you still have to go from point A to point B, and whatever that distance in light years is, it takes way too long for us to consider feasibly going there and coming back. Well, if you can eliminate some of these concepts, is what is apparently happened with these craft, what they do is they're able to generate their own gravitational field. And without getting too technical, they are able to manipulate time, which is something we have been very much aware of for a couple of decades at NASA, is that gravity slows down time in contrast to what we normally think of as 60 seconds a minute and so on. There is no constant relative to that except in one place in terms of the gravity. In other words, the gravity field is the same on the surface of the Earth, but when you leave the surface of the Earth, strange things begin to happen in terms of time. Fact is that time speeds up the further away from a gravity influence you get. Well, these machines machines create intensified gravitational fields, which in effect slow down time as we see it, and are able to cut down on the amount of time it takes to go from point A to point B. The other point is that if they're able to focus a gravity field on another point, they're able to stretch or pull together points A and B as if you view, let's say, space as like a waterbed. If you put a bowling ball in the middle of the waterbed, the bed kind of wraps up around the ball. Well, this is very typical of what happens in space. If you create an intensified gravitational field, you warp the distances between the two. In other words, shortening the distance between A and B, making the whole concept more feasible. And that's, in a nutshell, really how these things operate, is by warping space and time and getting into some real interesting astrophysical sciences. It interprets into a much more feasible method of travel.
So it's not like getting from A to B, the old linear travel. It's,
exactly.
The technology is kind of antimatter.
Well, there are some systems that use what is referred to as an antimatter reactor, which is an extremely powerful system. It uses super heavy elements, well beyond those that we have been familiar with traditionally, like uranium. They are able to capitalize, apparently there's a low-grade B gravity wave, which is different than the atomic gravity that holds molecules together, that they're able to capitalize off that and amplify it. They use a series of amplifiers in order to focus it. It's a lot easier to focus 3 points than it is to just try to focus one. Typically with a telescope, we'll try to focus one. What we've learned in deep space science, like in the SETI project, is that if you put one antenna here, one in Arecibo, and you spread these around the planet, you can actually focus 3 different points, get a much bigger telescopic view. Well, this is very similar to the types of things that they're doing with gravity waves.
So presumably they've taken some of these elements heavier than uranium down here, and we've now got them in our hands and they're being examined.
Now, that's another interesting phenomenon, too, is that we apparently have about 500 pounds of this, of the fuel, shall we say, the heavy gravity stabilized fuel, the systems that are used. How we got that is remarkable, because it only takes about 223 grams to operate one of these things. We don't even know how long. I mean, it's a lot longer than the average car will last, I'll tell you that.
Now, when the disk travels near another source of gravity, such as a planet or moon, it doesn't use the same mode of travel that we learned about in our science lessons. When a disk is near another source of gravity, like Earth, the gravity A wave, which propagates outward from the disk, is phase shifted into the gravity B wave, which propagates outward from the Earth, and this creates lift. The gravity amplifiers of the disk can be focused independently, and they are pulsed and do not stay on continuously. When all 3 of these amplifiers are being used for travel, they're in the delta configuration, and when only one is being used for travel, it's in the omicron configuration. As the intensity of the gravitational field around the disk increases, the distortion of space-time around the disk also increases. And if you could see the space-time distortion, this is how it would look. As you can see, as the output of the gravitational field from the amplifiers becomes more intense, the form of space-time around the disk not only bends upward, but at maximum distortion actually folds over into almost a heart shape around the top of the disk. Now remember, this space-time distortion is taking place 360 degrees around the disk. So if you were looking at the disk from the top, the space-time distortion would be in the shape of a donut. When the gravitational field around the disk is so intense that the space-time distortion around the disk achieves maximum distortion and is folded up into this heart-shaped form, the disk can't be seen from any vantage point, and for all practical purposes is invisible. All you could see would be the sky surrounding it.
Now, the vehicle that you just described, how similar was it to the very first sighting that you had back in 1951?
Quite similar. It was basically the same plan-form vehicle. They were double saucer, lenticular. But if you're going to be going in and out of atmospheres like Earth or other places might have, you certainly need a little more aerodynamic type of vehicle. And the saucer has the capability of going through the air at tremendous rates of speed and handling the bow and trailing wave without making shock waves. So it can be very silent while traveling at big rates of speed through the atmosphere.
And we're looking to the west, and it's an observation deck. And all of us are standing there. And a little after 7 in the morning, about this time, this craft comes out of the water from our left to our right and just goes like this, and then stops out there in front of us. Now, here again, double elliptical saucer-shaped craft, but at the mid-beam on this, there's a light going back and forth like this at the mid-beam on it.
Okay.
Okay, pretty much equal as far as in design, top and bottom, double elliptical. Now, it sits out there and then almost instantaneously disappears. So everybody's excited about what they're seeing and everything, and about this time somebody yells, "It's back." And it's now a little bit closer, about 100 yards out, maybe 100, 200 feet off the water. And it then demonstrates, as far as going up and down, side to side, cants left and right, then cants at an angle, and goes right back into the water. Now, when it goes into the water, and when it came out of the water, there was no explosion or implosion as far as it went back in. And
so what was the size of this vehicle? Could you estimate?
Oh, 100 yards out, I'm going to have to guess that this craft was somewhere around, and I'm guessing, I'm saying probably 50 to 60 feet overall length.
Okay.
Okay.
So it wasn't huge.
No. But what was amazing about this, I had the opportunity later on to be able to meet the astronaut, Gordon Cooper. And I had asked him about it, and he said, "Bill, it's when you have a electromagnetic propulsion, there's a force field around it. It's like that craft is inside a sandwich, so that when it comes out of it and when it goes back in, you're not going to see the explosion or the implosion." So that was one of the explanations I was trying to find out.
They don't really fly, Bill. They operate just like diving bells. They come in, they wobble almost as if they're weightless. They do their thing. They usually don't go from A to B over a long distance. They're very localized. When they're through doing what they're doing, they sort of tilt up and they're drawn almost straight up like they're attached to a string or something. They just go right up. So they really don't fly. And when they do move, they don't create a sonic boom. They're able to take right-angle turns, but it's almost as if they're being directed by something above them, by some kind of invisible energy. They seem to have infinite mass to throw away, but don't seem to have any mass themselves. When they stop and hover, they sort of waft and wobble almost like a boat on an ocean of water, but they seem to be on an ocean of turbulent air. When they move, they go up and down like this, almost like a boat would in the water. So whatever they are, they seem to be able to almost become lighter than air and operate, and not as aircraft operate, but in a different way altogether.
Right. When they take that 90-degree angle that they've been seen taking, do they wobble at that time? No, they usually wobble just before changing direction after hovering. The 90-degree angle seems to be a 90-degree turn without a curve radius at all, which seems to be almost impossible when we think of our own aircraft and we think of our own physical makeup. What would happen to us if we did something like that? And they travel at a tremendous speed, don't they?
They've been clocked. We've talked to radar operatives who've clocked UFOs along the East Coast here. We had an alert back in the 60s, I believe it was, tracked at 18,000 miles per hour. That's orbital speed, and that's within the near envelope of the Earth, without burning up, without a sonic boom, and able to take right-angle turns at this speed.
Well, I can remember when I was in the service in the 728th Aircraft Control and Warning Squadron, and our radar tracked an unidentified object going across the sky at that speed.
At 18,000 miles per hour, yeah.
So when we had heard reports on it, we put the two together and we said it had to be something. We never did find out really what it was. They didn't scramble fast enough to get it.
In the 1950s, Commander McLaughlin, a Navy commander who was in charge of V2 experiments down in White Sands, New Mexico, they were using a theodolite, which essentially is a telescope that also gives you readings of altitude and azimuth, and they were tracking a V2 and a whack copperl, I think, attached to it, when they saw something else, and they managed to get the theodolites on this object, and it was about 56 miles up and going about 7 miles per second. And they actually got photographs of it, which have never been released. But that was a terrific speed for that time. It was certainly nothing that we had. It was egg-shaped, and they could actually see it through the theodolite as they tracked it.
Now, we were talking about the physics of flying saucers, getting flying saucers around. Now, what is your theory on how a flying saucer getting from galaxies away to Earth, how would the physics work?
Well, we've got to understand that we come from a very primitive level in physics, and I've analysed the field that we're in, the gravitational field, as a time field caused by large number of little particles called gravitons, billions of gravitons radiating out from matter like light does. And when you analyse it as a time field, you then come to conclusions which are at a higher level than you do with Newtonian physics.
So getting here from light years away isn't done by physical movement, it's done by time?
That's right. You develop around the craft a time field very similar to the way light does when it comes from distant galaxies, and you can travel, you could go to the French Riviera for afternoon tea.
Now we're getting close. We're getting very close here.
If you understand the physics, you can then develop the craft.
How do you know?
Well, I've looked at the motion of the planets and analysed the planets using this physics. And it all fits in. It fits in with electric fields and magnetic fields, all as dimensional time fields. And there are a very large number of people who have now been calling me, doctors of science, who have called me saying that they are very, very interested in the physics.
You believe in flying saucers?
I do. When you look at the large number of galaxies there are in the universe, the Hubble Space Telescope analysed just a 5-cent area of the heavens, and they found 25 galaxies, each with around 100 to 200 billion stars in each one, and that's throughout the whole of the cosmos, then the chances of there being life elsewhere is astronomically high.
You've filed quite a few patents. Let's have a look at some of the inventions. The Jetson's light aircraft.
Yes.
Well, how does that work?
Well, that's like a flying saucer, and what that does, it's very similar to the lens of a camera, which this graviton field, it refocuses the graviton field in the direction of where the craft wants to go, and the occupants of the craft, in fact, have no G-forces on them. And that's why these flying saucers can change direction with 100 Gs compared with our jet fighter pilots who can only withstand about 8 or 9.
What about the machine that identifies abnormal magnetic fields in the body?
Okay, well, I gave a lecture to the Physics Society at Sydney University a number of years ago, and the professor of medicine there said that I gave them a number of ideas, because when you look at magnetic fields as time fields, you can then understand that that cells, when they reproduce and break up, if they're in an abnormal time field when they form, they then form cancers, and so we can look at cancers from that perspective as of time fields.
What happened to your theories, your paperwork on flying saucers?
Well, when I put my patents in, I put one provisional patent with 10 inventions into the patent office. They were taken by the Australian Defence Department and the Australian Safeguards Office, and I have that in my book, the letter that I got back from them. And one of my daughters found this high-tech bug. I think I had it here somewhere. Here it is there. That's a 5-cent piece. Let me just
pick this up. So you're saying you gave all this information for patents and the Defence Force confiscated it?
Well, that is
bugged your house?
That's a security bug that the CIA, the Americans, use, and the Australian security forces use.
So do you think the Australian Army or intelligence is actually space travelling as we speak?
No, but they are wanting to know. This is Star Wars physics. It's all Star Wars physics, and the Americans are spending trillions of dollars on Star Wars physics. The stealth bomber is part of it, and they're monitoring what everybody's doing, and I probably just happen to be one of those people.
So you believe have aliens visited us?
Well, in my book I explain Noah's Ark and what Ezekiel saw and a number of other things, and it would appear from the technology that we've been visited for a very, very long time. And when you take into account that some of the galaxies are over 1 billion years older than Earth, there's a high probability that we've been looked at just the same as we look at animals in national parks and things like that. And
when do you think I'd be able to get to Paris for afternoon tea?
Well, it all depends. If we can if we can get the finance, there's trillions of dollars worth of inventions that we can develop, and the motor car and highways and traffic jams and pollution will all become redundant. So we've got to get into this Star Wars technology on a commercial basis and let the military look after their thing, but we need to start doing it so that we can have our afternoon tea on the French Riviera.
Sounding good to me. And if you'd like to know how you can do this and perhaps expand on your knowledge, it's called The Physics of a Flying Saucer. Fascinating to listen to your words. Thank you very much for joining us. Ted Roach.
The round surface area of the support legs also vibrate as part of the entire spaceship in a spiral-shaped anti-gravity oscillation. Each ship has 4 such vortex centers, 3 at the landing pads and the 4th at the bottom center of the ship itself. This would explain the many single footprints observed in the snow during winter contacts. At this site, which Billy recorded on 8mm movie film, the grass continued to grow in a counterclockwise motion for over 2.5 months. The anti-gravity oscillation of the beam ship is far more powerful than the normal gravitational field of planet Earth. Thus, the new force field overcomes the old gravitational field and creates in the plant life a gravitational shift, which the plant life assumes to be correct. This counter-gravity force then lingers for a period of time until it becomes weakened through age, and the Earth's gravity once again can take command.
Next question.
Have you found out anything about the method of propulsion that the vehicles use?
Say again?
The method of propulsion that they use.
Well, obviously it's an anti-gravity machine, but the one part of the technology that they did give us, or help us develop, was called nuclear MHD, nuclear magneto-hydrodynamics power. And you need an engineer to explain how that works. But we do have several vehicles that are powered by this.
This scientist believes that man holds the secret of anti-gravity and can produce flying saucers at will. We interviewed him at a private house in Perth.
I continued to do my research, and I wrote Dr. Maxfield a letter, and that was perhaps my mistake. I said, look, I've done it. I've figured out the wave equation that we were looking for. And again, in my ignorance, I didn't realize how much work had already been done and gone before me. I was just kind of on the periphery or the edge of this whole development.
That's a device to be able to make things like flying saucers fly, is it?
Yes. Also, it's a device to store energy in the form of motion, like of a small star or a big atom. It's called, this is a long word, an MHD plasma, magneto-hydrodynamic plasma, like ball lightning, and it contains itself. But it's a way to turn all sorts of electricity into a high-voltage battery. Now, this would have been an immediate solution for the Middle East oil blockade at that time. Now, I wrote the letter in good faith, trying to say, look, we can stop the threat of war in the Middle East by using this as an alternate energy source. It's very portable, it's non-polluting. It had some byproduct radiation problems, but things we could solve. And it'll be cleaner than fission or fusion. Now, that's when people here in this country, at the Aeronautical Research Labs, politicians started to get a hold of me. ASIO contacted me. Good grief. An ad infinitum chain of intelligence people, including 2 CIA people from the States. And then the FBI eventually started looking for me in this country, and that again was after the intelligence war over there, after Hoover died. And I was unable to finish my research in this country. In fact, I met many dead ends in government departments and research facilities where they told me privately, like Dr. Tom Keeble in the Aeronautical Research Labs. He told me, yes, we know about the flying saucers your countrymen have built, and in England and in Canada. And in fact, we have film records of them here in the RAAF files. I said,
I want to stop you there.
Yeah.
Are you saying, Stan, that there are such things as, let's call them flying saucers, but they are built on Earth?
Yes. That doesn't mean that I rule out the possibility of other flying devices or intelligent beings visiting the planet either from the oceanic bottoms or deeper areas or from other areas in space. But I am positive that we have the technology, I can even name you the companies and people involved, in making high-speed electric aircraft that do look, strange enough, like a saucer.
What sort of proof can one furnish for that?
Oh, good grief. The briefcase I've got down here is full of documented evidence that is not all secret. If you go to the records of the New York Herald Tribune, the newspaper, it's now defunct. I think it's being stored in the Wisconsin State Historical Society. And look for November 20th, 21st, and 22nd, 1955. There are 3 articles in the series on anti-gravity and the various companies and people involved in the research in the United States, Japan, Europe. The list is like a who's who of nuclear physics. It was written by Ansel E. Talbert, the science and aviation editor for the New York Herald Tribune at that time. You can look there. You can look in the electrical engineering index for that period between 55 and 58.
That's a long time ago.
Yes. 57, about March, the security curtain went down. And there were, at that time, over 100 published universities and organizations, including the Gravity Research Foundation, which is still operational in Gravity Village in the United States. There were over 100 of these things operating to develop gravity, the control of it as a power source and communication and locomotion, etc. Now, in 57, the blanket went down with security, and there was no more reported news on it to say either that it was a dead-end research avenue, that everybody had stopped working on it, or that it was highly successful and there had been a few breakthroughs. There was just nothing. It went quiet. And if you go back in the period and look, you will see that for a number of years after 57, there was no mention of this sort of research in print. Behind the scenes, there was a lot of discussion, and even MGM Studios made the movie The Forbidden Planet, revealing at that time a lot, as though it were fiction, of the technology and why it had to be covered up. I think Walter Pidgeon starred in that, and he did a good job. Basically, they decided that mankind wasn't ready for it yet because he proceeded to misuse it like he had the atom or the hydrogen bomb. Just looking at events in the media, for the first 10 years of that 20-year period you're talking about, people that saw UFOs or flying saucers were nuts. They were played that way in the media. It was a bad thing to even talk about it. Now, toward the end of this 20-year period, if you see one, you're a great guy in the neighborhood. Everybody wants to talk to you. Everybody wants to know you. Pilots, physicists, all kinds of people are coming forward now. Presidents, dictators. Yes, I've seen a UFO. Now, to me, the shift in the public conditioning medium is to get people ready for the announcement of the new technology. Now, scientists aren't going to come out. Industrialists aren't going to come out and say, okay, here it is, children. Here you go. The new model for planet Earth using this technology must be independent of any established government or order. It can't be Russian or capitalist or dictatorial. It's got to be independent. And the only way you can do it is an external culture, whether it be called from the ocean bottom, whether it's from the Bermuda Triangle, or whether it's from outer space. They have got to see it in this way so that for a short time, the masses will overlook their cultural differences to unite, to form this one world order. Then, after 7 or 8 years, if you can hold the ruse that long, you explain to them, this is how we brought peace. I still maintain, I don't think that it'll work, because at the top, these organizations are fighting. UFOs, if they don't exist, or these electric flying saucers, if they don't exist in our current technology, I'll give it to the world. I'll be a hero, but I'll tell you right now, I don't need to do that. It's already done. This does not mean that in the past, before 47, 49, whenever the first flying saucers were supposedly sighted on this planet, does not mean that the time before that was to be explained by Earth technology. It wasn't. Even back in the Bible, in Moses' encounter with God, and the flaming bush, and don't walk on this ground with your shoes on, take one off. It sounded like he was in a field at any rate. Ezekiel's flaming chariot. You go back thousands of years and you find we had encounters with things that could only be explained in their own words as being from the heavens. In the last 2,000 years after the birth of Christ, we find that these encounter cases were, many of them, more bizarre, where they didn't have the same good side to them. People suffered headaches, some cases disappearance, livestock were cut apart and the blood drained out of them. You see it quite frequently now. It seems as though the more recent contact cases from these extraterrestrial origins have been malevolent or bad, whereas the Old Testament versions were benevolent or good. We do have the technology now to give UFOs, or the electric flying saucers, to the world. It is when I say we, it's a joint scientific effort from many of the countries of the world: Russia, United States, England, Canada. Now, it is just the manner in which to announce it.
I obtained photographs that were taken in 1967 by a military pilot, Harvey Williams, flying a C-47 for the Air Force at 12,000 feet, approximately 25 miles southwest of Provo, Utah. This particular vehicle matches the so-called A.R.V. In all proportions and respects in terms of the detail of the shape of the craft.
When you look at some of the photography of UFOs, going all the way back to some of the earliest photography we know of, McMinnville, Oregon, for example, you see the same general layout, you see the same general configuration, the flat bottom, the sloping sides, a little dome in the middle, sometimes pointy, sometimes almost like the top end of a cylinder that's been chopped off, sometimes a perfectly round dome, sometimes even, you know, like a cone on the top. So it suggests that, you know, there's many different variants of the system, but the overall arrangement of the components is basically the same. And I kept saying to myself, you know, this is just too much of a coincidence. You know, maybe this goes back a lot further than anybody knows.
In fact, in a translation of a Sanskrit text written by a Middle Eastern king in the 11th century, there were references to Vimanas, or flying machines, with a propulsion system bearing a striking resemblance to that of the ARV. Strong and durable must the body of Vimana be made, like a great flying bird of light material. Inside, one must put the Mercury engine, with its iron heating apparatus underneath. By means of the power latent in the Mercury which sets the driving whirlwind in motion, a man sitting inside may travel a great distance in the sky.
One of the things that they describe when you read up on the literature surrounding these so-called Vimanas was the so-called Mercury vortex or Mercury turbine engine.
I see the word Vimana. Can you describe how that relates?
Well, this is something that I spent a lot of time reading up about the so-called Mercury turbine generators, or Mercury vortex generators, described in some of these ancient Sumerian texts. And so I started looking at the possibility that there had to be some kind of circulation going on in the Mercury itself. So that was the kind of thing that I visualized would be going on inside the chamber.
The central column has a number of components, a couple of counter-rotating cylinders. It sounds very much like the device that the Nazis were developing in the Wenceslas mine in Poland towards the end of the Second World War. There seems to be some evidence that they were trying to develop some kind of an anti-gravity propulsion system or a zero-point energy device.
I think it was Timothy Good published a story, maybe above top secret, where he found a researcher who was following developments by the Nazis at the end of the Second World War, and it looked like they'd been developing flying saucers up in Poland in the Wenceslas mine, and they had this thing that looked like Stonehenge, where they had all these high voltage cables coming into it and these chains that would hold something down, and they had this thing called the bell, the Dasgloka, that was down in this mine in Wenceslas, and that it involved a ceramic dome, and it had two cylinders inside with a mercury solution circulating in it. And the two cylinders were inside an electromagnetic field, and they were counter-rotating, and they had this mixture of mercury, thorium, and beryllium. Now, it looks like there's a high-voltage electrical discharge that's being sent through the mercury, and that is somehow doing something that enables this anti-gravity effect to occur.
At one point, Mark contacted and interviewed possible UFO abductees to gain insight on the technology they may have seen in the alien craft, something he had in common with McDonnell Douglas in the 1960s, and possibly numerous other corporate and government entities since the 1940s.
I wound up going to my management and telling them, you know, you're not going to believe this, but the UFOs are clearly coming from someplace else. They're clearly manned or humanoided, and the only question is whether we're going to figure out how they work before Lockheed or after. And so as a result of that, the company at that time, which has now of course been bought by Boeing, over several years put in about $500,000 worth of research effort under my direction to study gravity control techniques and also analyze UFOs. We hired some a police detective to interview witnesses, abductees. We had experimental work and theoretical work. So it was kind of a fun project.
In the course of all this, it occurred to me that one of the other resources that I might be able to draw on was people in the alien abduction community.
I began to think, well, these people are either crazy or they're really having an experience of some kind. And some of them even talked about implants that were being recovered from their bodies. And so I was intrigued, and I thought, well, okay, if any of these stories are true, there might be a chance, however slim, that if they really were abducted by aliens, they might have gotten a tour of the ship. They might have seen some propulsion system components. And so I heard 3 of these young ladies being interviewed on a radio station out of Las Vegas. This was sort of the precursor to Art Bell and Coast to Coast AM. It was the Billy Goodman Happening. And he was interviewing Cynthia Vodovos, Melinda Leslie, and Alicia Davidson.
Contacted the station. They put me in touch with these 3 young ladies. I interviewed them individually, and much to my surprise determined that these young ladies seemed to be bona fide examples of the phenomena, with implants that could be seen on medical MRIs. So what I did was I simply asked them to describe what they saw, and without disclosing anything that I already knew about the components inside the alien reproduction vehicle, I found that these young ladies, at least one of them in particular, was able to describe not only components that strongly resembled the ones that were inside the alien reproduction vehicle, but they were also at a higher level of sophistication that actually gave additional clues about how the ARV actually functioned.
Alicia Davidson described being escorted into the engine room and seeing the propulsion system components. And it involved a central column that was made of a transparent glass-like material. And she said there was a silvery fluid that was spiraling upward at the bottom of this column. Down in kind of this well that was in the center of the spacecraft was this little tiny flywheel-like mechanism spinning, which matched the ARV also. And this is at a point when this young lady had never seen any of the drawings that I'd done of what the ARV was structured like. I was just talking about propulsion components in general. But then she said that when you looked across this little well, this lowered floor area in the center of the room, was like a guardrail around it. She stood there. You could look across, and she said it looked like below the deck she was standing on was this glass-like material with these coils of wire going through it. And they were spaced out in the same proportions as the ones on the ARV. The thing that she said that was most significant was that the column itself was rotating in one direction, and the flywheel was spinning in the opposite direction. There was counter-rotation, which is something that's often been reported in UFO sightings. You see components on the craft that are spinning in opposite directions.
Back here on Earth, the scientific community has been busy since the end of the Industrial Revolution. There have been dozens, perhaps hundreds of US and international patents dealing directly with electrokinetics and electrogravitics, going back to the turn of the last century. It would be safe to assume private industry and the military have also been working on a great deal of related applications off the public record. In short, since Nikola Tesla's first experiments with pushing electricity around, mankind has had a thing for anti-gravity.
If you look at these 2 illustrations, this is a patent that was secured in May 30th, 1967 by James Frank King, Jr., who happened to work with Thomas Townsend Brown in the labs of Agnew Bonson. But you can see a striking similarity between the 2 vehicles. On the one hand, you've got a sort of a frustrum-shaped fuselage section. You've got a series of coils that wrap around the crew compartment, although the crew compartment in this instance is more of a cylinder. But you also have a central column that goes down through the middle, and you have this capacitor section that's in the bottom. and then you have these little flight control mechanisms here. You know, I find it really remarkable that there's so much similarity between the two objects.
Mm-hmm. And when is that patent from?
May 30th, 1967. It's called a magneto-hydrodynamic propulsion apparatus. And so I started thinking, well, maybe it's like a cyclotron. Maybe there's an electrical discharge from this. Basically, this whole thing looks like a giant Tesla coil. It's got the capacitor array. It's got, you know, a central column that looks like the secondary windings of a Tesla coil. And this might even go back to something that Nikola Tesla discovered back in the 1940s. And, you know, it just was all hushed up. And all the UFO sightings we've ever seen were something that came from Nikola Tesla and not from another planet. And I mean, these are the things that were all going through my head at the time.
So it was really surprising to find all the different sources that I encountered that seemed to provide useful information as to how this thing was made, how it worked, what its energy sources were, and it was all really fascinating to me, and that's one of the reasons I pursued it. It wasn't because I was, you know, like I say, trying to breach national security. I was just insatiably curious about how these things work.
And he said it was remarkably simple. There wasn't that much to it.
The ARV system, for all of its claims of flashy, out-of-this-world propulsion capabilities, was indeed remarkably simple. It could be described as a large-scale, souped-up Tesla coil, designed to negate gravity and inertia, with off-the-shelf navigation and life support systems bolted on, almost as an afterthought. You could think of it as the Model T of anti-gravity vehicles, an industrial dune buggy, or crude hot rod that can get you to Mars in a few minutes. In this version at least, first-class seating was still a way off.
From everything I've been able to gather, it helps to understand what some of the components are. There's a large capacitor array on the bottom of the craft. It's in the smallest version, it's 24 feet in diameter. The outer edge of the plates and the capacitor section itself are shaved off at that same 35-degree angle. So you have a series of plates that are progressively smaller as you get higher and higher in the stack. And there's 48 sections that are all set up like that. Through the middle of the crew compartment is a central column that's called the amplifier section that's in the middle of the craft. On the very center point of that column is what looks like a large 9-foot diameter flywheel type mechanism. Then around the belt line of the crew compartment is about a 2-foot wide coil of wire that's embedded in the same glass-like material that the capacitor section plates are embedded in.
And there's a kind of flange or fairing that traps the top and the bottom surfaces of the coil. You can see that it traps it there and at the top. But in between are a series of explosive bolts that run all the way around the craft. They said above this ledge there is looks like a door out of, you know, your stereotypical cartoon submarine, you know, has a steel frame that's embedded in the side of this protruded sphere that makes up the crew compartment. And he said, and it had a wheel on it with little spokes that you would turn like an old, you know, Captain Nemo submarine with the pins that would go out and lock into the door frame, and it had a seal on it so it'd be airtight.
And then the ejection seats are mounted back to back. There's 4 of them in the smallest version of the craft, and they're mounted on this central column on a set of rails.
In the event of an ejection, the explosive bolts separate the top and the bottom halves of the crew compartment, and the entire outer sheath of the central column pulls away along with the upper half of the crew compartment and the ejection seats. This crew compartment sphere can actually function as kind of a rudimentary re-entry vehicle coming down through the atmosphere, and then once you get, say, below 14, 15, 16,000 feet, the thing will pop a chute out the top, and the ejection seats drop off on these rails one by one, and the pilot can drift down in a parachute or with a parachute. Because this flywheel-like mechanism is turning all the time, the individual pilot or crew members have a kind of a pan that's right below the front of the ejection seat that affords them a place to put their feet.
Now, the control system on the vehicle, on the ejection seat that the pilot sits in, on the one hand it looks like a a high voltage potentiometer, or like a rheostat on the one side, that has a couple of big heavy duty cables that come out of it and goes into the central column. And that's basically the amount of power that he has in the system. And on the other side, there was sort of an inverted J-shaped piece of metal that came up and over like that had a sphere on it. Now on the bottom of the sphere there is a sort of a bowl that's sort of slightly larger in diameter, but it conforms to the shape of this sphere.
Of all the components of the ARV, the navigation system, while perfectly logical and even elegant in its design, has to be the strangest one. It's an entirely unknown paradigm in steering an aircraft or anything else, yet makes perfect technical sense. If one were to make the case for truly alien aspects of the alien reproduction vehicle, this might be the first example they'd use.
The sphere itself appears to be a kind of a domed arrangement where you have a number of fiber optic leads that come into the sphere, and for each one of the 48 capacitor arrays there's a series of sensors that are then used to sort of relay information to the individual plates. And so then on the bottom of this you have a bowl that moves around and can be used to convey the commands of the pilot in terms of what he wants to do in terms of shaping the field around the vehicle. And right in the center of that bowl is a kind of laser diode that sends a laser beam up into the underside, the inside of this sphere. And so as the bowl moves, that laser is sort of scanning around on the inside of the different sensors that are responsible for each of the capacitor sections. Then will, there's a series of relays that'll open up and close and let a certain amount of energy in, or prevent it from going in. And when it's dead center, it means that all of them get the exact same amount of information. You just go straight up. If you want to bank to the right, then you bank this to the right. It sends the laser signal over to the opposite side of the dome, and it says that the opposite side of the craft is going to get more energy, so it banks in that direction. It's kind of like in a helicopter, in the swash plate of a helicopter. When you want to bank to the left, you create more deflection in the main rotor on the right side so that it begins to bank to the right, or bank to the left, excuse me. So it's kind of the same principle.
Then you have an oxygen supply that's strapped to the lower part of the central column down here in the lower part of the crew compartment. You have a much larger set of oxygen tanks, and these are all protruded vessels, by the way. There's no steel or aluminum in terms of the oxygen supply in the vehicle. There was also a pair of oxygen tanks under the seat, and that was assuming that maybe you had to eject, when you were 25 or 30,000 feet, and you needed some air to get you from up there down to the place where you'd actually be able to breathe ambient air.
I said, well, were there windows? And no, there weren't any windows. He said there was a thing called a synthetic vision system. And he said there were 6 or 7 of these little plastic bubbles around the top of this thing, one on the very top in the center, and then maybe 6 around about halfway up from where the ledge was to the very top, and they were spaced at even distances. And he said in each one there was a little CCD camera. So the synthetic vision system was set up so they would take 2 cameras and it would have a converging point of focus in those 2 cameras, so that it would just be like looking through a set of binoculars. So you'd have a left and a right eye view, and it'd give you a 3-dimensional view outside the vehicle, but with no windows. And the reason for that, apparently, was that this aircraft was using extremely high voltages, and the voltages would ionize the air around the vehicle so much that it would start producing X-ray photons, which are absolutely lethal. So you have to have basically a barrier to protect yourself.
You also have a robotic arm that seems to be blended in with a composite fairing sitting right on the top surface of the capacitor array that has the ability to extend outward with a little air-driven claw that's on the end of it. In fact, I think that the craft's magnetic field or electromagnetic field is probably so powerful that conventional little electric motors probably wouldn't work in this kind of an application.
Where they took the panels off the side of the aircraft is that they had Zeus fasteners that were these little, like,
quick spin lock things that they put on there to hold the panels. The panels are all like a fiberglass material. It's all composite. The entire vehicle appeared to be covered with what he's referred to as a goopy lead paint. It looked like little flecks of lead that had been suspended in kind of a resin and just painted haphazardly over the outside of everything on the vehicle, with the possible exception of the door itself and these little blisters that house the synthetic vision system.
So why would it be goopy lead paint?
Well, the theory is that the electrostatic field created by this huge capacitor array and the ionization that occurs just because of the propulsion system might be enough to create a level of ionization around the craft that's high enough that it would produce X-ray photons of its own accord. And so you would want to be able to protect the pilot and the crew members from that radiation. So anyway, that's the general overview of the structure of the vehicle. This is a vehicle that has the ability to travel up to or beyond the speed of light. And part of the reason that it's able to do that is because it exploits the energy form that's embedded in space-time that's responsible for the effects of mass and inertia.